Dained, in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean during World War II, naval warfare evolved into a brutal contest of engineering, intelligence, and hidden firepower. Ordained. Battles were no longer decided only by the number of ships, but by what those ships carried inside their steel hulls. Ordained. Among the most devastating developments was a particular type of naval shell designed not just to hit enemy vessels, but to annihilate them from within. Japanese cruisers. Once feared for their speed, torpedoes, and disciplined crews, would soon discover that armor and maneuverability meant little against a shell that detonated deep inside the ship's core. This was not ordinary firepower. It was calculated destruction. Naval engineers in the United States refined shells that could penetrate thick armor belts, delay detonation, and explode near ammunition magazines or engine rooms. When such a shell struck, the damage was catastrophic, often ending the fight in seconds. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggressive surface engagements, but it underestimated the power of internal destruction. As the war progressed, this hidden firepower reshaped the balance at sea. Cruisers that once dominated night battles suddenly vanished in towering columns of fire and smoke. Sailors described explosions that seemed to come from inside the ship itself, and ripping decks apart and snapping hulls like paper. This article explores how one type of shell, quietly improved, rarely discussed, changed naval warfare forever and destroyed Japanese cruisers not by brute force, but by lethal precision aimed straight at their heart. Before the Pacific War began, Japanese cruisers were considered some of the most advanced in the world, designed for speed, long-range combat, and heavy torpedo attacks. They were built to overwhelm enemy fleets through aggressive tactics. However, their design philosophy carried a fatal weakness: internal vulnerability. To achieve high speed and heavy armament, compromises were made in armor layout and internal compartmentalization. Japanese engineers focused on resisting external hits, not on surviving internal explosions. This assumption would prove disastrous. American naval planners, studying earlier naval engagements and ballistic data, reached a different conclusion. They believed that the real killer was not surface damage, but internal detonation. If a shell could penetrate armor and explode near boilers, fuel stores, or ammunition magazines, the ship would effectively destroy itself. Japanese cruisers carried large quantities of high, explosive ammunition and oxygen-fueled torpedoes, which made internal blasts far more destructive. Once ignited, fire spread rapidly through poorly protected compartments. Damage control teams, though brave and disciplined, were often overwhelmed by heat, smoke, and cascading explosions. The difference in philosophy meant that when Japanese cruisers faced American heavy shells, the results were unbalanced and brutal. A single well-placed hit could cripple propulsion, knock out power, and ignite uncontrollable fires. What looked like a minor penetration from the outside often resulted in massive internal destruction. This vulnerability was invisible until it was too late, and by the time Japanese commanders realized the threat, the Pacific was already littered with burning wrecks. The shell responsible for this devastation was not revolutionary in appearance. It did not rely on size alone or exotic materials. Its true power lay in its fuse and penetration characteristics. Sing naval shells were designed with hardened caps to punch through steel plating before exploding. The key innovation was the delayed action fuse. Instead of detonating on impact, the shell waited fractions of a second, just long enough to travel deep into the ship's interior. This delay turned the ship's own structure into a weapon against itself. When the explosion occurred, blast pressure was trapped inside compartments, multiplying its destructive effect. Steel bulkheads became shrapnel, ripping through crew spaces and machinery rooms. Japanese cruisers, packed with ammunition and fuel, were especially vulnerable to this type of attack. Once a fire reached a magazine, the result was instant annihilation. Survivors often described a sudden white flash followed by total darkness as power failed and the ship began to die. From the outside, observers might see only a single hit. From the inside, it felt like the ship had been struck by lightning. This hidden firepower transformed naval gunnery from a battle of attrition into one of sudden death. It rewarded accuracy, fire control, and intelligence over sheer volume of fire. As American radar and targeting improved, these shells end their marks with terrifying efficiency, sealing the fate of many Japanese cruisers long before the enemy even came into visual range. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized decisive battle, one massive clash that would cripple the enemy fleet. Cruisers were intended to scout, harass, and deliver torpedo strikes under cover of darkness. In early engagements, these tactics worked. Allied ships were caught off guard, and Japanese night fighting skills were unmatched, but doctrine could not compensate for physics. Once American forces adapted and began using radar-directed gunfire, the battlefield changed completely. Radar allowed accurate targeting through darkness, smoke, and weather, turning night into daylight. Combined with armor-piercing shells, this technology neutralized Japan's tactical advantage. Cruisers that once struck unseen were now illuminated on radar screens, targeted with precision, and hit where it hurt most. Japanese commanders often reported confusion as ships suddenly lost power or erupted in flames without warning. The speed advantage that once saved them now only ensured that internal damage spread faster through vibrating hulls and ruptured fuel lines. Damage control training, while rigorous, was undermined by design flaws that allowed fires to leap from compartment to compartment. In contrast, American ships emphasized survivability, redundancy, and compartmentalization. Even when hit, they often stayed afloat. Japanese cruisers did not enjoy the same resilience. When struck by a shell designed to explode inside the hull, their fate was often sealed. The doctrine of decisive battle collapsed under the weight of internal destruction, proving that strategy must evolve alongside technology, or perish. One of the most terrifying aspects of internal shell explosions was their psychological impact. Sailors could not see the enemy shell approaching, nor could they easily understand what had happened once it struck. There was no gradual build-up of damage, only sudden chaos. Lights went out, fires erupted, bulkheads buckled, and screams echoed through smoke-filled corridors. Survivors described the sensation as being attacked by an invisible enemy from within their own ship. Morale suffered deeply as crews realized that even near misses could be fatal if a single shell penetrated at the wrong angle. Japanese cruisers often carried extra ammunition, for extended engagements, increasing the risk of secondary explosions. Once fires reached these stores, no amount of bravery could stop the outcome. Commanders faced impossible choices: continue fighting a doomed ship or order abandonment while under enemy fire. Many ships were lost within minutes, giving crews little chance to escape. This psychological shock rippled through the fleet. Reports spread quickly, and fear began to replace confidence. The myth of invincible cruisers shattered as ship after ship vanished in fireballs visible for miles. The hidden firepower of internal, detonating shells proved more devastating than any torpedo spread or aerial bomb. Not only destroying steel hulls but also eroding the fighting spirit of a once dominant navy. One of the clearest demonstrations of this hidden firepower came during the brutal night engagements around Guadalcanal in late 1942. In the chaos of close-range naval combat, American battleships like the USS Washington unleashed radar-directed salvos against Japanese forces that still relied heavily on optical targeting. When American armor-piercing shells struck Japanese cruisers, the results were catastrophic. Observers described towering columns of flame erupting from within hulls rather than from the outer armor. It was not simply impact damage, it was internal annihilation. Japanese cruisers, designed for speed and offensive torpedo strikes, lacked the internal protection necessary to contain these explosions. Once a shell penetrated and detonated near engineering spaces, boilers ruptured and superheated steam tore through compartments, scalding crew members and disabling propulsion instantly. Power failures followed within seconds, plunging ships into darkness and chaos. Without power, pumps failed. Without pumps, fires spread unchecked. In some cases, daned. Secondary detonations ripped ships apart before damage control teams could even reach the affected areas. Daned. Survivors later recalled that the explosions felt as though the ship had been punched from the inside. The destructive chain reaction often began with a single penetrating hit. Radar had allowed American gunners to achieve accuracy previously impossible at night, and when paired with delayed fuse shells, that accuracy became lethal. The engagements off Guadalcanal proved that the future of naval warfare belonged not just to bigger guns, but to smarter ammunition capable of destroying a warship from its very core. The vulnerability of Japanese cruisers was compounded by a dangerous feature they carried with pride: the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. Powered by compressed oxygen, these torpedoes were unmatched in range and explosive force. However, oxygen-fueled systems were inherently volatile. When an armor-piercing shell penetrated a cruiser's hull and detonated near torpedo storage areas, the consequences could be devastating beyond calculation. Flames ignited oxygen lines, daned, and what followed was often a chain reaction that magnified the initial explosion tenfold. Instead of absorbing the blast, the ship effectively became a bomb, daned. This design risk was rarely considered before the war because Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive superiority. The belief was that these cruisers would strike first and decisively, never giving the enemy a chance to exploit weaknesses. But once radar, guided fire and penetrating shells entered the equation, those assumptions collapsed, daned. Internal detonations frequently reached torpedo mounts stored on deck or near the superstructure. The resulting blasts were so powerful that entire sections of ships disappeared in seconds. Hull integrity failed almost instantly, leaving little opportunity for organized evacuation. The tragic irony was unmistakable. Daned, the very weapon that gave Japanese cruisers their fearsome reputation, became a liability once the enemy learned how to strike beneath the armor. Daned. Hidden firepower turned offensive strength into catastrophic weakness. Daned. And the Pacific Ocean bore silent witness to the devastating consequences of that design gamble. Armor itself became part of the problem. Daned. Japanese cruisers often featured strong belt armor along the waterline, but weaker deck protection and insufficient internal layering. Daned. American naval engineers understood that shells fired at long range descended at steep angles, increasing the likelihood of deck penetration. When these heavy shells struck from above, they bypassed the thick SID armor entirely. Once through the deck, delayed fuses ensured detonation deep within machinery rooms or near ammunition magazines. Daned. The physics of plunging fire favored those who understood ballistic trajectories. American gunnery doctrine increasingly emphasized long-range engagements for precisely this reason. Daned. It minimized torpedo threats while maximizing the probability of internal explosions. Japanese cruisers, built for aggressive mid-range combat, were not optimized to withstand such attacks. The deck armor, though present, could not consistently stop high-velocity shells descending from thousands of yards away. When penetration occurred, explosions beneath the armored deck trapped blast pressure inside the hull, amplifying structural damage. Bulkheads warped, ventilation systems spread smoke, and communication lines were severed almost instantly. What had once been a sleek, powerful warship became a floating inferno within minutes. This shift toward long-range, radar-assisted plunging fire marked a decisive turning point in naval warfare. Daned. It demonstrated that armor thickness alone could not guarantee survival, especially when the enemy's true weapon was not brute force, but daned precision-guided internal devastation. Magazine explosions represented the ultimate nightmare. Every cruiser carried vast stores of shells and propellant charges below deck. Carefully organized but inherently dangerous. Armor-piercing shells were specifically engineered to seek out these vulnerable spaces. When a penetrating round detonated near a magazine, the initial blast often ignited stored propellants, triggering an explosion far more powerful than the shell itself. Entire ships could be obliterated in a matter of seconds. Witnesses described massive fireballs rising hundreds of feet into the air, followed by debris raining down across the sea. In some cases, ships simply vanished, leaving only oil slicks and scattered wreckage. These catastrophic losses sent shockwaves through naval command structures. They revealed a sobering truth. No matter how skilled the crew or how fast the ship, survival depended on internal protection and damage control capacity. Japanese cruisers, designed with offensive aggression in mind, lacked the redundant safety measures increasingly emphasized by American shipbuilders. Anti-flash doors, improved compartmentalization, and better fire suppression. Systems became priorities for Allied navies, but for many Japanese cruisers already in service, such modifications came too late. The hidden firepower of penetrating shells exploited a vulnerability at the very heart of warship design. A single well-placed hit could unleash a chain reaction so violent that rescue became impossible. It was destruction not measured in minutes, but in seconds. As the war progressed into 1943 and 1944, the cumulative impact of this hidden firepower reshaped the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Japanese cruiser losses mounted steadily, weakening reconnaissance capabilities and reducing escort strength for carrier groups. Each sinking represented not only material loss, but also irreplaceable experienced sailors and officers. Meanwhile, American ships grew increasingly resilient, incorporating lessons learned from early battles. Improved internal compartmentalization, advanced firefighting systems, and superior radar integration created a widening technological gap. The delayed fuse armor-piercing shell remained a constant threat, quiet, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Japanese attempts to adapt were hindered by industrial limitations and resource shortages. Shipyards struggled to repair damaged vessels, and new construction could not keep pace with losses. The psychological toll intensified as crews recognized that survival depended less on courage and more on whether the enemy achieved that single penetrating hit. Naval warfare had entered a new era, one where unseen precision outweighed raw aggression. The shell that destroyed Japanese cruisers from the core symbolized this transformation. It was not celebrated like aircraft carriers or famous admirals. It did not have a dramatic name, yet its impact was undeniable. Beneath the waves of the Pacific lay the silent testimony of ships undone not by surface damage, but by explosions that began deep within their own steel hearts. By 1944, the pattern had become undeniable. Engagement after engagement showed the same brutal sequence: radar contact, ranging salvos, sudden penetration, and catastrophic internal detonation. Battles such as the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the later surface clashes around Leyte Gulf demonstrated how dramatically naval warfare had shifted. Japanese cruisers entered battle prepared for torpedo attacks and rapid maneuvering, but American ships, often opened fire accurately before visual contact was even made. The shell's delayed fuse gave it a cruel advantage. Armor ceased to be a shield and became merely the doorway to destruction. Once inside, explosions shattered communication networks, jammed turret rotation systems, and ignited aviation fuel stored for reconnaissance floatplanes. In some cases, secondary fires burned so intensely that ammunition hoists acted like chimneys, feeding flames straight into gunhouses. The damage cascaded through the vessel faster than any crew could contain it. Even ships that did not sink immediately were rendered combat ineffective within minutes. Strategically, this meant fewer escorts for carriers, weaker screening forces, and declining morale across the fleet. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once feared for its surface combat skill, increasingly avoided night engagements against radar-equipped American battleships and cruisers. The hidden firepower of penetrating shells had fundamentally changed risk calculations. It was no longer about trading broadsides. It was about surviving the first accurate hit. And more often than not, Japanese cruisers did not survive it. Survivor accounts from the deigned sea sinking cruisers provide chilling insight into what internal detonation truly meant. Sailors described bulkheads flexing inward, as if struck by a giant hammer from inside the ship. Superheated gases raced through ventilation shafts, turning passageways into deadly tunnels of flame. In engineering compartments, deigned, ruptured steam lines created invisible clouds that burned lungs instantly. Men who survived the initial blast often found themselves trapped behind twisted steel, forced to navigate darkness illuminated only by fire. Officers struggled to issue commands as communication cables melted and sound-powered phones failed. In many instances, the explosion that began in a machinery room or near a magazine caused immediate flooding as seams split below the waterline. Water and fire battled simultaneously within the hull, creating chaos beyond comprehension. Damage control teams fought bravely, but their efforts were frequently overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the internal blast, ordained. The terrifying realization that the ship had been mortally wounded by a single shell spread quickly among survivors. Some later reflected that external torpedo hits felt predictable, an impact from outside, a known threat. But these penetrating shells felt different. They turned the cruiser's own strength, its steel hull and tightly packed interior, into a trap. The explosion did not merely damage the ship, it consumed it from within. Those who escaped carried the memory of that sudden internal apocalypse for the rest of their lives. Dane engineering analysis after the war revealed just how decisive delayed detonation shells had been. American ordnance specialists refined fuse timing carefully, balancing penetration depth with explosive yield. Too short a delay would waste energy outside the hull. Too long a delay risked passing entirely through the ship, deigned. The ideal timing ensured detonation within critical compartments, engine rooms, magazines, or command centers. Metallurgical advances also improved shell integrity, deigned, preventing premature shattering on impact. This meant that even heavily armored cruisers could not rely on belt protection alone. In contrast, deigned Japan faced mounting shortages of high-quality steel and industrial capacity as the war dragged on. Repairing damaged cruisers became increasingly difficult, deigned, and upgrades to internal protection lagged behind Allied improvement. Hence, American ships incorporated anti-flash systems, reinforced bulkheads, and more effective firefighting infrastructure. The divergence in survivability widened dramatically. Naval architects worldwide took note, deigned. Post-war warship design increasingly emphasized compartmentalization and magazine protection precisely because of lessons learned from these catastrophic internal explosions. Deigned. The hidden firepower that had destroyed cruisers from the core became a case study in the power of intelligent ammunition design. Deigned. It proved that innovation at the level of a single shell could reshape entire fleets and alter strategic outcomes across an ocean-wide theater of war. Beyond the technical and tactical implications lay a broader strategic transformation. The steady attrition of Japanese cruisers weakened the screening forces protecting aircraft carriers, supply convoys, and troop transports. Without strong cruiser escorts, larger capital ships became more vulnerable to air attack and submarine threat, deigned. The loss of experienced gunnery officers and engineers compounded the damage. Each sunken cruiser represented years of training and institutional knowledge that could not be quickly replaced. Meanwhile, American industrial production surged, launching new ships with improved radar systems and more advanced ammunition. The balance of power shifted irreversibly. Deigned. What began as a contest of fleet strength evolved into a demonstration of technological superiority. The shell that detonated inside Japanese cruisers symbolized this shift perfectly. It was quiet in development, uncelebrated in headlines, yet devastating in effect. It revealed that naval dominance no longer depended solely on ship size or crew bravery. Precision engineering and fire control integration mattered more. Deigned. The Pacific War thus became a proving ground for a new era of naval combat, one defined by internal destruction rather than visible impact. Ordained cruisers that once ruled the night seas were rendered obsolete by a weapon designed not to scar their armor, but to shatter their hearts. In the end, Deigned, the story of hidden firepower, is not just about one shell or one navy. It is about the evolution of warfare itself. The Pacific Ocean became a laboratory where innovation determined survival. Deigned, Japanese cruisers were formidable machines, crewed by courageous sailors and guided by bold commanders. Yet even the finest war-deigned ship cannot withstand a weapon engineered to bypass its defenses and ignite its core. The delayed fuse armor piercing shell demonstrated that true power lies in precision. Deigned. By the time the war concluded, the wreckage scattered across the Pacific testified to a harsh lesson: survivability must be built from the inside out. Future warship designers would never again ignore magazine protection, compartmentalization, or fire suppression. Deigned. The hidden firepower that destroyed cruisers from within reshaped naval architecture for generations. It proved that sometimes the most decisive weapon is not the one that looks the largest or loudest, but the one that strikes unseen, penetrates deep. Deigned and turns a ship's own strength into its undoing. Deigned. Beneath the calm waves of the Pacific today rest the silent remnants of cruisers that learned this lesson too late. Victims not of surface scars, but of explosions that began in the very heart of steel,